Designated by Mr. Lawson of Florida, pursuant to House Resolution 8, I inform the House that Mr. Lawson will vote nay on House Resolution 483 amendments. He votes nay.
That was Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, one of the leaders of the radical progressive squad in the Democratic Party, crying last week after voting present instead of voting against a vote for U.S. funding for Israel's Iron Dome missile defense system, which happens to be the closest thing America has to achieving former President Ronald Reagan's vision for a Star Wars missile defense system. While the rest of the squad voted against funding this defensive missile defense system for Israel, AOC voted present. And she put on a nice show crying, showing her constituents how bad she felt that she was somehow forced for political reasons to not vote against the bill that is pro-Israel. But AOC's crying theatrics is not the story here. Not at all. The bottom line is that she and the rest of her Democratic progressive squad are anti-Israel and anti-America in the worst way. That they even want the U.S. to stop providing the funding for Israel to properly defend innocent Israeli citizens while taking no action against the true evil villains in the region like Hamas and Islamic Jihad, who are the ones who shoot rockets to kill innocent Israeli civilians. While at the same time, Republican Rand Paul is totally 180 degrees the opposite on that vote. Wait until you hear the full story that really did not get the proper coverage in context. Folks, as you know, social media censorship is growing. The best way to support our video work for Israel is to subscribe to our video newsletter on pulseofisrael.com and to share our videos. If you are already a subscriber, then thank you. First, let's start with a little background information on Israel's Iron Dome system and the funding. Anti-Israel people like the Squad, including AOC, paint the Iron Dome system as some Israeli military project, one that the U.S. should not fund. However, that is far from the truth. Like many U.S.-Israeli military projects, the U.S. funds them because they don't just benefit Israel, but they benefit the United States of America and the American people as well. Check out this recent headline. The U.S. Army's Iron Dome could be headed to Ukraine, the U.S. Iron Dome. And the subline reads, quote, a House bill wants more money for Kiev's defense and a missile defense system might be in the mix, unquote. Now let's get into the details in the article. Quote, since being deployed in Israel in 2011, this system, built by the Israeli defense company Rafael in partnership with Raytheon, a U.S. company, has proven itself one of the world's most effective killers of short-range missiles. The Israeli military has said Iron Dome has knocked down about 90% of missiles fired into Israel over the past several years, unquote. As we can all clearly see from this article, the Iron Dome missile defense system is far from being an Israeli project that the U.S. just provides funding for. No, it is a joint U.S.-Israel system that, while the U.S. provides the funding, Israel is the one who provides the constant technological development and real-life testing of this system for the U.S. to then be able to use for itself or for her allies, like potentially Ukraine. Basically, funding the Iron Dome is not just about Israel having the ability for Israeli citizens to protect themselves, but about the U.S. getting benefit from it as well. This is the actual modus operandi for many, many joint U.S.-Israel military projects. The U.S. provides funding, Israel focuses on the technological development and real-world usage, and then transfer of that know-how back to the U.S. for the U.S.'s interest and to protect American citizens. By the way, as I mentioned earlier, this Iron Dome missile defense system is the closest thing to former President Ronald Reagan's vision for a Star Wars missile defense system. If we just take a look at this Wikipedia page focused on the Star Wars system, it says the following. It's actually called the Strategic Defense Initiative. Quote, the Strategic Defense Initiative, derisively nicknamed the Star Wars program, was a proposed missile defense system intended to protect the United States from attack by ballistic strategic nuclear weapons, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and submarine-launched ballistic missiles. The concept was announced on March 23, 1983 by President Ronald Reagan, a vocal critic of the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, which he described as a suicide pact. Reagan called upon American scientists and engineers to develop a system that would render nuclear weapons obsolete. End quote. Now that is partly what the U.S.-funded Iron Dome system is about. And that is why the U.S. funds the development and upkeep and testing of the system and real-life usage of the system by Israel, not just for Israel's benefit, but again for America's benefit. So when the Squad and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez want to stop funding the Iron Dome system, they are not just hurting Israel's chances to properly defend innocent Israeli civilians from Hamas or Islamic Jihad rocket attacks, but they are hurting the United States' ability to continuously learn and have this Iron Dome system developed to then be able to benefit America and America's interests. Now let's focus on the fact that by voting against the funding of this Iron Dome missile defense system, this Democratic progressive squad that pride themselves on caring about human rights and all that progressive mumbo-jumbo that are all about lies, they're actually supporting the indiscriminate killing of innocent Israelis and the actual killing of more innocent Arabs. How so? Because if Israel does not have the ability to use Iron Dome to shoot out rockets in the sky as a defensive system, then more innocent Israelis will get hit and possibly killed by the rockets shot at us by our enemies. And Israel will have to use more lethal force on the ground against our enemies when attacking them, bringing about even more deaths to their innocent civilian population. So, while they pride themselves, these squad members of the Democratic Party, on supporting human rights, by supporting to defund Iron Dome, they are really supporting the terrorist activities of Israel's enemies and supporting a step that would lead to more deaths on both sides. That's not supporting human rights. To make matters even worse, back in May, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez drafted a resolution aimed at blocking a $735 million sale of precision-guided missiles to Israel that was approved by the Biden administration. The maddening irony, once again, is that these precision-guided missiles are assisting Israel in keeping civilian deaths low in Gaza, even though the world still bashes Israel for civilian deaths. Yet these virtue-signaling anti-Semites want to stop selling these weapons to Israel and help us keep civilian casualties low. Just watch this video to see how precise Israel is in trying to damage Hamas assets and operatives without killing their own human civilian shields. And this is what these anti-Semitic U.S. politicians want to stop providing to Israel. And yet they call themselves progressives and human rights activists. Now let's switch to Republican Rand Paul, because he actually also voted against the funding for this Iron Dome in the Senate. But the headlines about this don't do Rand Paul justice, because it sounds as if he too is anti-Israel like the Squad, which he is not. That's totally not the case. The devil is in the details. He voted against the bill in its current form because he wants the U.S. funds that would fund the Iron Dome, which he supports, to come from the money the U.S. is instead using to fund the Taliban in Afghanistan. As a spokesperson for Rand Paul said in response, quote, he proposed that we pay for the House bill with money that is going to go to the Taliban instead. Now there is logic. Rand Paul is against the U.S. giving money to enemies of the United States and the freedom-loving world, and he wants those U.S. funds instead to fund the Iron Dome system, but not with additional printed U.S. money. Instead, the money that the United States is wanting to send to enemies of the U.S. and the freedom-loving world. Again, total logic. To help America. Bottom line, America needs more principled politicians like Rand Paul, who wants to punish American enemies like the Taliban, Hamas, and Islamic Jihad, and he wants to support American allies like Israel, instead of politicians like AOC and the Squad, who they punish American allies like Israel and instead support terror-supporting enemies like the Taliban, Hamas, and Islamic Jihad, who are also anti-America. As the anti-Israel, anti-American Squad in Congress has grown, from 4 to 12 in the last election, this is a very worrying sign of the times of a changing America. That group will grow from election to election. Israel must realize that long term, we will not always be able to rely on America or the Democratic Party, since we can't be dependent upon the growing squad who are not just anti-Israel, but anti-America. Hopefully, the freedom-loving people in Israel and the United States of America will together overcome the growth and damage, tremendous damage, that these radical leftists, like the Squad in America, and like-minded leftists here in Israel are doing to both of our countries and to the whole freedom-loving world.
Pulse of Israel, frontline videos from the Holy Land. Support our work by donating today.